Welcome all to another brown bag. I think everybody here is out in the hallway already knows Jacob Skousen. If not, know that Jacob started at ISAS in 2009 and worked for a year, more or less, at the Mississippi River Bridge project, which is where I first met Jacob. And in 2010, because of that meeting, he became a grad student in the department. And in pretty much record time, at least for people in that department, got his PhD done, defended early, I forget when exactly, in 2016, with a wonderful dissertation that he's going to convert into a book at some point. He's also pretty well published with another edited book, and yet he's working on another edited collection and for a journal, maybe the Cambridge Archaeological Journal. And then a half dozen or so articles that some of you have read. And so Jacob early on was interested in pilgrimage and dissertations on the Emerald site, and became, and maybe was always interested in roads and ancient avenues and things. And so did that work in Emerald, became interested in the Vincenns Trace as well, and of course was at the other end of the Vincenns Trace is, that was the name of the site? The Otter Pond site, which we're going to hear about today. It's going to be remarkable and wonderful, and we're all going to be amazed at the gray images that he's going to show us. So take it away, Jacob.
Thanks. Tim always makes me sound better than I really am. So it's wonderful to be here. Thanks for this. And when I say preliminary thoughts, they are really pretty preliminary right now because, as you'll see, we don't know much about southeastern Illinois, especially the Mississippian period, which is what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about the Vincenns period, but first, before I do that, I'm going to kind of situate my research and talk a little bit about Vincenns phase and then Otter Pond before I talk about my projects. Like everything that I do, it all starts with Cahokia. You all know a fair amount about Cahokia, I imagine, so I'll breeze through this. It was a large city, the only pre-Columbian city in North America, north of Mexico, built relatively quickly, within a decade or two probably, of 1050 AD, lasted for about 300 years, about 1350, it was largely abandoned. When we talk about Cahokia, though, being a city, we're really talking about a larger area. We're talking about three kind of centers or ritual ceremonial centers: Cahokia, East St. Louis, and St. Louis. We know nothing or very little about St. Louis Mountain because it's gone and likely never to be uncovered unless we decide to dig up St. Louis, which maybe we should. East St. Louis, we have learned a lot recently, of course, through the Mississippi River Bridge project and Cahokia. Between these places, there were a lot of people. This was like a continuous urban sprawl. And with that, there were a lot of people, a lot of houses, a lot of mounds. Between these three settlements, Cahokia had roughly 10 to 15,000 people. East St. Louis, recent population estimates put it near, if I remember correctly, 7,000 to 8,000. St. Louis, likely due to its size, thousands, who knows, really. Between those three, we're talking close to 20,000 people. If you add the hundreds of villages, farmsteads, hamlets, nodal sites, shrines, ceremonial centers, kind of in the surrounding region in the uplands, we're talking about another couple thousands probably. So in the greater Cahokia region, it was truly urban. We're talking between 20 and 30,000 people for at least 100, maybe 200 years. We also recently have started talking about Cahokia's construction as being constituted by a new religion. And again, Tom and Tim have talked about this a whole lot. So if you really want to know stuff, you should read their books and articles and things. Just brief introduction to this religion. It had it was based in a number of things, a very specific view of the cosmos and the cosmic structure, but also a great emphasis on underworld feminine powers of fertility, world renewal, and probably had something to do with the moon and corn mother goddess type figure. Cahokians were very concerned about these things and were constantly trying to connect to these powers and forces and interact with them in ways that presumably work to their favor. Okay, but what's really interesting to me, I mean, all that stuff's interesting, but recently what's really interesting to me is, and again, this is not new stuff, but pretty much simultaneous with the rise of Cahokia around 1050, we see the movement of Cahokians all throughout the Midwest, particularly to the north early on, interestingly. And we know from excavations and surface collections and kind of a lot of data that has been compiled in recent years, we see Cahokians influencing, settling among local populations in these far-off, distant places. In some cases, they built shrines like at Trempealeau and possibly at Carson, which is actually down south along the Mississippi River. We also see Cahokians actually setting up residence in largely local settlements. So like Aztlan seems like Cahokians or people really closely related to Cahokians just settled among people who were living up there in this large kind of palisaded community. We also see Cahokian objects. If we haven't dug at a lot of these suspected Cahokian outlying outposts and things, we see their objects. We see Ramian-sized pots, we see chunky stones, we see long-nosed god masks, flint clay figurines. Again, a lot of these things are kind of rare, especially the flint clay figurines and long-nosed god masks, but we see them spread all over the place. These were likely ceremonial objects or paraphernalia that were worn or used during certain ceremonies and activities that we think largely started at Cahokia and spread outward. We also have a number of other things that are really interested in Cahokia's spread throughout the Midwest. Again, like I said before, 1350, Cahokia was largely abandoned. And like with many places throughout the world, large urban centers, people just don't die out. They move. They leave. When we see abandonment, these people have to go somewhere. So where did these people go? And a lot of people think they know, and that's probably true. They likely spread throughout the plains, throughout the north, throughout the south, so on and so forth. But what's also really interesting to note is that around 1100, we see the spread of Mississippian culture or Mississippian places throughout the southeast, which probably had to do a lot with these Cahokian journeys to distant places. So we see, Angel and Kincaid, Abayan, Mound Bottom, a bunch of others, Moundville even, and Etowah. We see these centers start to pop up kind of throughout the southeast around 1100. But what's really interesting too is that we don't really know about this area here. There's this kind of dead area right there, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. We don't know what Cahokia was, how they were dealing with people in that area in southeastern Illinois. From sporadic surveys and limited archaeological work that's been done, we know that Mississippian people did live in this area. We call them Vincenns phase people. It's a terrible name, Vincenns phase, whatever. But that's what they're called. And this is the area that I'm talking about. And the Otter Pond site is the site I'll be talking about in a minute. But again, the big questions that made me start being curious about the Vincennes region is, like Tim said, there's the Vincennes trace. It's a historically known thoroughfare that goes pretty much from Cahokia, really the American Bottom region as a whole, right across to a modern-day town, Vincenns, Indiana, which is about there. And lo and behold, there's this large site, Otter Pond, that is right along this trail. So that got me thinking and interested about this area. So the big question to me is, what are the Cahokian connections to this Vincennes region? And if there are connections, what are they? And if there is no influence between Cahokia and the Vincennes region, why? What about these people? How were they able to stay away from Cahokia or reject or just ignore Cahokia's kind of influence? Okay, so now I'll give you a brief introduction to what we know about the Vincennes phase, the terrible name that I maybe someday will want to change because it's really boring. So Vincennes phase. Again, it's a Mississippian manifestation in southeastern Illinois, southwestern Indiana. When I talk about Mississippian manifestation, I'm really talking about a time period, but also particularly a way of life, a culture, a way of doing things, of living in the world. And as most of you know, Mississippian culture or Mississippian way of life involved people making and using shell-tempered pottery, building platform mounds, growing and consuming maize, and a number of other things. And a lot of people now think are leaning more towards, a religious aspect of Mississippian culture is really what constituted it, but also how it spread. So we see that in the Vincennes region as well. This is the area that we're talking about. It's kind of a complicated map, but there's a reason for that. We don't really know the boundaries, the extent of the Vincennes phase region. There's a heartland circled in this blue area here, or by this blue line. This is what was originally defined as the Vincennes region, and it's kind of spread beyond that, but really we don't know the extent of it. And what's really interesting, too, is that the Vincennes region is kind of right in the middle of all these other cultural traditions that were either contemporaneous or earlier than Vincennes. We've got Albee phase people to the northeast or northwest. We got Yankeetown to the south, and then Oliver and Kaskaskia Mississippian groups to the east and west. So that's kind of the area. This is what we think we know about the chronology, and it's pretty sad. Generally, we haven't done much work at these sites, so there's a limited number of radiocarbon dates. If you take all of these and subtract the outliers, like the 820s and the 890s and things like that, which I think are way too early, I think Vincennes settlements or the Vincennes culture was around from 1100 to 1400. Again, it's pretty crude, not a lot of resolution, and that's something that really needs to change. And here it is lined up with Cahokia's chronology and a lot of the major events in Cahokia's history. Again, it's really limited. There's a lot of gaps, a lot of things we don't know. And really what's frustrating for me is that while we know a lot of the kind of major events that happened in Cahokia's history, we can't really tie them to anything definitive in the Vincennes region. Again, just due to the lack of work. So, I was hoping you'd like that. That took me like hours to do that video. So you should appreciate that. Okay, so enough of that. Here's a brief few images of the pottery of the Vincennes region, or from Vincennes phase sites. It's a lot like late Mississippian pottery we see kind of everywhere. It's kind of crude, not real fancy. You've got very highly everted rims. It's generally shell tempered. Sometimes the shell is mixed with sand or grit. A lot of it's, again, either chord mark, most of it's plain, kind of nondescript stuff. So that's the pottery. It's mostly jar forms. You have some bowls, some plates. And based on, again, Kirsty and others knowledgeable in ceramics will kind of look at this and say, oh, well, that's later. No, it's post-1200. It's not any time before that. At least that's what Kirsty probably should say. But, but you know, you take it to other people throughout the Southeast, they will say, this does not look like anything like Cahokia pottery at all. Okay? Until you get much later, like post-1200. Okay. Diet, we know just a little bit. They ate corn minimally, but they also supplemented their corn diet or their maize-based diet with other things like deer, fish, turtle, mussel shells, as well as starchy seed crops, goosefoot, knotweed, things like that. What we know about the settlement system is pretty minimal as well. Howard Winters was the guy who really defined the Vincennes phase back in the 60s. He believed that the Vincennes phase was, or the Vincennes area was dominated by a central town and a number of smaller towns, and those were also surrounded by smaller villages and hamlets like we see in the Cahokia region, demonstrated here in this nice little picture. And if we look at the distribution of Vincennes sites in kind of the heartland area, this does kind of seem to make some sense. Otter Pond is the red square there, and then you have a number of single mound centers or villages, whatever you want to call them, kind of scattered throughout, which are these green triangles, and then a bunch of smaller, probably farmsteads, villages, whatever you want to call them, marked by these yellow things. Okay. Now, moving to the good stuff, hopefully. Otter Pond. It's located in the center of the heartland of the Vincennes region. Here, it's located just north, like less than a mile north of modern-day Lawrenceville, Illinois, which most people don't know really exists. It's closer to Vincennes, Indiana. More people know about that place because it's a little bigger. The site was first recorded in 1957. It was described as a middle Mississippian village with 5 or 6 mounds and kind of a central habitation area. Howard Winters revisited the site in '62 during his survey of the Wabash Valley. He claimed that it had 12 mounds and a central plaza. I, with the help of Mike Farkas, looked at LiDAR data from the area, and I disagree with both of them. I think here's the boundaries of the Otter Pond site as they currently stand. I think it actually consists of 9 mounds and a central plaza. I'm guessing that Howard Winters saw a lot of surrounding mounds and kind of lumped that in with the with the Otter Pond site. But I don't think these mounds are really part of the site. I think they're earlier middle woodland to late woodland mounds. If you look at the whole kind of area around Vincennes, Illinois, there are a ton of middle woodland and maybe like late woodland, I don't know, mounds. Just kind of central to the sites that they're in, probably had some houses around them. Anyway, I don't think these mounds or possible mounds around the Otter Pond site are part of the central part of the site there. So, my work at Otter Pond actually took place this year in March, and it involved magnetometry survey and surface collections. I've had a lot of help from a lot of actually volunteers from ISAS, none of whom are here, unfortunately, right now. They're off doing geophysics now. I'm kind of jealous. I also had a lot of help from a lot of local people interested in archaeology down there. To give you an idea of how magnetometry works, and again, a lot of you know a lot about it, and a lot of you probably don't. Essentially what it is a way of detecting fluctuations in the Earth's natural magnetic field that are caused by things under the ground. So buried rocks, buried archaeological features, those things also have their natural magnetic signatures. And as you walk along with a magnetometer, you have a sensor in the top. Probably better seen here. You see this contraption I'm carrying there. The sensors in the top are sensing the natural magnetic fields that the Earth gives off, and the ones at the bottom are sensing the magnetic fields that things under the ground are giving off. And through magic and through a lot of processing I don't fully understand because it's all internal within the machine, it creates images based on the differences between the Earth's magnetic field and what we're seeing. Okay, so this survey that we did covered about 44,000 square meters, about half of the Otter Pond site and a bunch outside of it. And it took about 5 days to do. I think I calculated one day, because I was like the only walker out there for a number of days. I think one day I calculated I walked 7.5 miles or something like that, and yet stayed within a quarter-mile area, whatever that means. Okay, here are the results of that survey. I'll let you kind of look at it for a minute. As with anything having to do with geophysics, this is actually, the results are really good, but it's not always intuitive what you're seeing here. So, what you're seeing, I think, is a number of things. Obviously, there are some big mounds there. You can see the one over, I need a stick, but over there you see a mound there, rectangular, likely a platform, flat top mound, and then you see another one there. You also see a bunch of noise kind of scattered about. This is my interpretation of this. Hopefully you can see it. No. Well, no, because this TV screen. I need a pointer, a stick or something. But what you can see is that the blue areas are the mounds, what I believe are the mounds. And if you look at it here, I'll scroll back and forth so you can kind of see what hopefully I'm seeing. So we know that there are these two mounds here and here, but then there were a series of 4 mounds, 2 of which I think you can see pretty well. This one and this one. Those two not so much. You also see an opposing mound down here. Again, it's just a very noisy area that I kind of guess the outlines of. There's also supposed to be another few mounds right here and right here, which are much harder to detect. And again, these smaller mounds that are harder to detect, they may be largely plowed away because if you go back to the topographic map, they were bumps on the landscape, probably maybe carved away a little bit by the people to kind of emphasize a platform or kind of some area where they did some ceremony, built houses on something like that. So these mounds are much harder to see. In fact, I don't know if they're there at all. We also see what's really cool. What we first noticed was that a lot of these mounds have really complex construction histories, especially this one. Looks like there were a number of earlier mounds that were built and then covered over, and other structures and possibly other mounds were built, or iterations of the mound were built on top. This mound and probably that one and that one have structures, large square structures on top. And what's really neat about the one on the left there, it has a central black splotch, which I'm guessing is probably some large pit or hearth or something where they were doing a lot of burning or cooking or something like that. I would bet it's more like a ceremonial hearth or something. You also see a number of houses, structures. Hopefully, as I've scrolled back and forth, your eyes have kind of adjusted and you're able to see some of these squares. Some are not so obvious, some are. For example, and what's really neat here is that a lot of these houses have central pits. And so you can look for pits, obvious pits, and look at the houses, look for outlines around those. So there's one there, there's one there, there's one there, a couple here that are pretty obvious, a couple there, and kind of scattered throughout. Some obviously don't have the central pits. So that's the show and tell part. Here is the overall site without the background, and I think this gives you a better idea of how the community may have been organized. I think also we're seeing residential clusters. We see a lot of houses in one spot, or in several spots, but not others, which is kind of interesting how they built this settlement. Okay, so what did we learn from all of this? Well, again, it's limited what we did learn. But I think we learned that Otter Pond is a lot more like large Mississippian mound centers like Cahokia. Again, we have this pattern of mounds surrounding a plaza, which, according to John Kelly and other people, this probably represents or mimics some kind of generalized view of the cosmos and how it should work. You have a central plaza lined by mounds representing 4 directions, and if we were to take John Kelly's idea, there would be a central post or something to connect the upper, middle, and lower worlds. I don't see any central post in the Otter Pond data, obviously, but the idea is there that you have a centralized plaza, and it's surrounded by mounds on 4 sites. We also learned that these platform mounds had large temples or elite residences on them, which we see at Cahokia and other large Mississippian centers. And we see residential clusters like we see at Cahokia. These are 2 images of large-scale excavations at Cahokia that show kind of residential clusters, like, for example, this one. And again, there's time depth here, so structures date to different time periods. But you see these areas that were used over and over again for living space. And I think we're seeing that in Otter Pond as well. But what's really significant, I think, is not only that it kind of has this generalized Cahokian feel to it, but it's very different from what we know of settlement patterns before the Vincenns phase. So what we know about Alison Lamont villages in the Vincenns region, Alison Lamont was the middle to late woodland cultural manifestations in that area. They didn't build their settlements like this at all. They usually had a mound or 2 and a ring midden around it, and presumably structures within this ring midden. And they would throw their trash to the outside, creating this midden. It was very different than, obviously, what we're seeing at Otter Pond. And, of course, other contemporaneous groups and people near the Vincenns region or surrounding the Vincenns region didn't build their villages and settlements like this at all. This is the Noble Weeding site, which a lot of you know about. Very clear settlement pattern here. It's a circular village The houses are ringing the outside here with probably a central plaza, probably a mound in that area, possibly palisaded as well. This is not like Otter Pond at all. So, another thing we learned from this project was from little bits and pieces we picked up off the surface during the project. We see pottery looking, some of the pottery we found looking a lot like typical Vincenns phase pottery, with the averted rims, some cord marking, shell temper, just kind of large, kind of clunky vessels. Okay, but we also see a lot of forms from Otter Pond that look a lot more like pottery from Cahokia. The rims aren't nearly as averted. They're smaller in terms of what do they call the rim length? Sorry, rim length. The necks are different. They look a lot more like what we see at Cahokia. They're just not like this later stuff, this Vincenns pottery. So, from all of this, again, this is all preliminary thoughts. What did we learn from all of this? Well, I think that there was influence from Cahokia in the Vincennes region at Otter Pond, particularly. Particularly in terms of the settlement system or the settlement layout, how they built their space and lived in their space. But based on the pottery as well, I think that you just saw, I think that there was probably some more influence in more everyday domestic, in the domestic sphere. So, to really answer these questions about Cahokian connections with Vincennes, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Here's just a few things that need to happen. We need to get a better handle on the chronology. We need to get a better idea of the pottery of Vincennes settlements. Again, I see this just very distinct difference between these later looking forms versus these earlier looking forms. Whether that's chronology, whether that's two different groups living together, I don't know. We need to know a lot more about everyday life. Where did they live? How did they, disperse across the landscape? How did they build their houses? How long did they live in the houses? Did they abandon settlements or just continually build on top of them? Did they get along? It seems like they were. There are no villages with palisades that we know of from the area, but who knows? And we really need to learn more about the late woodland groups or the pre-Vincennes groups in the area. Again, we know very little about it. We need to either build a big highway through Lawrenceville or something, or somebody needs to get a lot of money to go and dig there to learn these things. And I think only as we do these things can we really start addressing the questions of what are the interactions, what are the connections between Cahokia and Vincennes groups. So that's all I have. Any questions?